So, according to Dembour, there are four main schools of thought regarding human rights. So we have the natural school, the deliberative school, the protest school, and the discourse school. So natural school is of the opinion that human rights are uh, naturally occurring, that they are, I guess, preordained by a higher power, and that all humans uh, have inherent human rights. Everyone has the same rights, and we are all each one of us has those rights, whether we realize it or not. The deliberative school is of the opinion that human rights are arrived at um, through deliberation, through negotiation of groups, whether that would be rights are arrived at through deliberation of society, of different political establishments, then uh, grant or approve of those rights. Protest school tends to see human rights as something that is a, a demand against power. So power is, or human rights are gained through struggle against inequalities of power, of resources, of political power, etc. And then discourse school essentially believes that human rights don't exist, that they are uh, only constructed through language and a product of culture and uh, human interaction. Um, so I created this graphic to kind of the author talks about these different concepts in relation to the forest schools. The author kind of has the background graph, the quadrant graph in the article, placing the forest schools on a kind of a quadrant graph. So you have the natural school, the protest school, the deliberative school, and the discourse school. But then the author kind of continues on to separate these out based into groups. So the top two schools uh, see um, human rights, as being transcendental, that they are like basically assigned by the creator, by a higher power, to all human beings. And then the other two schools, deliberative and discourse school, see human rights as something that are constructed through society, through language, deliberation, negotiation. The other aspect of human rights is kind of the individualist versus collective discussion, which we've had in other classes as well. So they divide these four schools into two different categories. Again, with the natural school and the deliberative school uh, taking on a liberal individual orientation to human rights, and then the protest school and the discourse school being more of a collective social justice orientation to human rights. To dive into each of the schools a little bit deeper, the natural school sees human rights as inherent and as universal entitlements, that everyone is entitled to or owed these human rights. They are derived from a transcendental source or from a higher power. Uh, so, if in the Christian sphere, God has given these rights to each person, each human being. But there's, I mean, whether that comes from God in the Christian sense or from other higher powers, it's kind of irrelevant in this space. But that's the concept there. And then human rights exist independent of social recognition. So whether human rights are enacted or enforced or are able to be claimed by an individual is irrelevant in terms of whether they exist or not, because the natural school says they exist, and their enforcement or their ability to be claimed is independent of their existence. The natural school is also the oldest school of thought in the human rights space. A quote from the article related to from one of the I guess the scholars that was cited in the article as being a natural school researcher author is if human rights are the rights one has simply because one is a human being, as they usually are thought to be, then they are held universally by all human beings. And this is Jack Donnelly. This is from page 13 of the article. The deliberative school sees human rights as a resulting from rational discourse and from a excuse me, consensus building process. Human rights then emerge from shared values, principles, and norms, and are deliberated and negotiated over time through dialogue, participation, and democratic decision making processes, which are essential to the deliberative school of thought's process for establishing human rights. And all human rights, according to the deliberative school, are based on the principle of human dignity. So, a quote from the deliberative school, or two quotes actually from the deliberative school. The first one is: "There's nothing sacred about human beings, nothing entitled to worship or ultimate respect. All that can be said is that about human rights is that they are necessary to protect individuals from violence and abuse. If it is asked why, the only possible answer is historical." This is from Michael Ignafe. This is from page 14 in the article. Human rights law is a fragmentary and largely persuasive mechanism, very much in the making. Sally Mary from page 15. The protest school. Human rights are fought for and achieved through social struggles, resistance, and activism. They are rooted in the experience of marginalized individuals and oppressed groups, and the protest school is very focused on empowering individuals and communities to claim and defend their rights. The author mentioned that essentially, if in the protest school, if you have access and are able to claim your rights, then it is your responsibility to help your neighbor uh, access and claim theirs. And if your neighbor has the rights, then your duty is to help your neighbor's neighbor or your neighbor's neighbor's neighbor, like to keep pushing the circle outward until more people have access to their rights. And the protest school is also believes that claims must be fought for to have value. There has to be this struggle uh, that people struggle through the process to get them, then they will value them and then also give them to others. A quote from the protest school: "The historical emergence and development of human rights needs to be understood and analyzed in the context of social movement struggles against extant relations and structures of power." And that is Neil Stammers from page 16 of the article. The discourse school is believes that human rights are constructed and shaped through language, narratives, and cultural practices. That human rights are the products of social and political discourse, and they are contingent and subject to interpretation, which is very different from uh, the natural school, which says they are inherent, like they cannot be changed, and there's nothing can take them away. And discourse school is saying that all human rights are contingent upon their ability to be enacted, enforced, or claimed. Um, and the discourse also school also believes that human rights are used by people in power to maintain the status quo and oppress others. A quote from the discourse school: uh, rights which are alleged to belong to human beings as such, and which are cited as a reason for holding that people ought not to be interfered with in their pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. The truth is plain. There is no such rights, and belief in them is one with the belief in witches and unicorns. And that is Alistair McIntyre from page 17 of the article. The other thing that came up in the article that I thought was interesting was uh, the paradox of human rights, which the author was saying essentially that when human rights are properly protected, there is no need. The people who have access to them often have no need to use them. And the converse of that is when people need protection, the protection that human rights provide, they are often not able to claim those human rights, and those human rights are not enforced, therefore creating the need for human rights protections. So one of the questions Dr. Ray uh, gave me was uh, understanding, like, what is Dembour's contribution to the human rights space. And essentially, I think it comes down to the points on the screen here, which is organizing and mapping the field. Like the he has organized these schools of the different perspectives into coherent schools of thought, and he's kind of condensed them across disciplinary boundaries. Um, they've provided kind of a mapping of key beliefs related to the origins of rights, how human rights are achieved, the function of human rights, and the core principles of human rights according to each of the schools. Um, which then leads us to the second uh, section, which is Dembour's shortcomings. Um, and I think after thinking about this for a while, that really, I think well, the article is helpful in a lot of ways. If it stops short of, in a lot of ways as well, I think it fails to account for the complexity of enacting rights. It kind of it kind of lightly touches on that in some of the schools, but for the most part, it ignores the fact that enacting human rights, um, enforcing human rights, is highly complex and very difficult. Um, it also fails to account for hybrid positions between the schools. It kind of silos schools and scholars, and those that may or may not be true, because I haven't necessarily read all of the scholars, but it seems difficult in that it doesn't leave room for taking elements of each one and forming different philosophies from that, or how all of these align together in certain ways. It's primarily concerned, the author is primarily concerned with the philosophy of the schools rather than their application to current events or current realities. the current status of the field and the reality of modern society related to each of these schools is also unaddressed. I mean, it would be a interesting topic for further research. Um, and I think the other thing is it's also just a bit too clean in terms of clean categories, clean concepts, and philosophies, which kind of glosses over the messy nature of human rights and their ability to be claimed or enacted or enforced. Um, and then finally, my observations and recommendations. I think it's important to remember that even natural or transcendental rights require enactment and enforcement. Um, we can we can say that people have those rights, but if they can't claim them and we are unable or unwilling to enforce them, then do they really have those rights? It seems like there should be some kind of disclaimer word in there. Like every person should have human rights, but do they have them? If they can't claim them or if we can't enforce them is a difficult question. Enforcement, I think the other thing that sticks out to me is that enforcement is largely failing around the world, where even in supportive states like the U.S., where women's rights are currently being eroded in a number of different ways in individual states. Um, I think it can be helpful to see these as schools of thought as elements of a toolkit for achieving a more just world. I think there's elements of all of these that are helpful, but if we see them as standalone pieces, um, it becomes much harder and they lose some of their functionality. Especially when you start talking about the deliberative school, the protest school, and the discourse school. All of those, there's different ideas and concepts and tools in there that can be used to further the cause of human rights, um, that are helpful, even if you believe in the natural existence of human rights. Um, I think it's important to acknowledge the complexity of human rights and their enforcement, lack thereof, etc., and the need for hybridity or plurality in discussing any human rights issue. And I think there's room for a blended model that utilizes all four schools um, and is not so, yeah, doesn't have such a siloed approach. And then finally, I think there's a need to move away from either or towards a more of a yes and mindset. We can, instead of saying human rights are either naturally gifted or implemented by a high power, or they're deliberative, established through negotiation or discourse, we can say, you know, human rights are established through a higher power, through a transcendental means, and we enact them, enforce them, and claim them uh, through the processes of deliberation, of protest, or discourse. So those are my thoughts on the article.